You can create beautiful works of art in Photoshop using illustration tools, whether it's art for art's sake, or maybe if you're doing it for a band or a movie. Regardless of its intent, you have some pretty cool options just in Photoshop, which we're going to go over today. So the tools that I'm using first are a tablet, a Wacom drawing tablet. Now, I'm not going to say you can't do it with just a mouse, but it would make it really, really difficult, so I highly recommend you get a tablet. Now, the digital tool that you're going to be using the most is the Paintbrush Tool in Photoshop, and of course the settings with the size and the type of brush that you use are all located in that point, as well as if you right click, it'll pull up the box for the size, hardness, and some general types of brushes here for you. Besides the size, two of the things we're going to pay attention to are the brush type and the hardness. For now, we're going to start with a 100% hardness and use a soft round pressure size or a hard round pressure size. What this means is your tablet can pick up how hard you're pressing down on the actual pen and make adjustments to the size of your line based on that pressure, just like it would if you were working with a paintbrush. So here I am using the tablet and pen to make some lines, and you'll see as I change my pressure they'll get a little thinner, so you can use this really well for sketching. However, there's another tool that we're going to use on and off, and it's located at the top of the screen. I don't even know what it's called other than it recognizes your pressure and changes the opacity. So if you click that and you start making lines, you'll see that not only does the size of the line change depending on your pressure, but how dark it is changes. So that's going to be really helpful for when we start doing shading in our drawings and our illustrations. If you're doing sketches, this also makes your sketches look more like it would if you were using a pencil, because if you think about it, your pressure controls the darkness of the graphite as well if you were using a real pencil on paper. Now it's time to practice. So I want you to pull up a Google search in images and search geometric forms with value, or you can search cubes with value or cubes with shading. Either of those searches, any of those searches will work. And this is the one I'm using, and I'm going to be referencing the cube on the far right. Now if you want to reference a rectangular prism instead of a cube, that is fine as well, because we're just practicing the technique. I recommend working with a split screen so you can continue to reference your photo as you work. Also, you're going to open up a new document, and I made mine 8 by 8 inches with a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. So I'm going to start by sketching out my cube, and I'm using a hard round pressure size brush, and I apologize because I'm not super experienced with working with the pen and tablet, so I need to practice as well. That's why some of my lines are a little wonky there. But you go ahead and do your sketch first on the background copy, and then add a new layer when we get ready to shade. Every time you work on a new section, you want to add a new layer. I'm going to start by filling in the front-facing surface of the rectangular prism I have here with my darkest value, so I'm changing the color. I don't want it to be completely black, but it's going to be pretty dark, and I haven't turned on the pressure with opacity setting up there at the top because I just want a solid color for now. So that's what I'm doing right now, is making my adjustments to the brush. You can't see the pop-ups on my screen recording, but I'm going to fill in that front-facing square with my darkest value. The one on the right, the plane on the far right, is going to be my middle value, and the plane on the top is going to be my lightest value. Now, something you'll see here is I'm not exactly perfect at staying in the lines, but especially for this one, you can clean it up really easily using Photoshop, and you can do that on everything you do, but with straight lines it's even easier, and I'll show you how I do that whenever I make a selection and just delete out the stuff that I don't want. Keep in mind that you can also use the pen tool to make a selection, as well as anything you select you can move if you make that your selection and fill it. So that's helpful if you're sketching things like a face and you make your eye too small. You can move it and do Control-T to transform it and change the size like I'm doing right now. It's going to be really helpful for you, and it's things you can't do if you're just drawing with a regular pencil. You'd have to erase and start over. At this point in time, I'm going to take my new layer that I'm going to use for the shadow and pull it underneath my other layers. That way I can be a little messy with my paintbrush and it'll just go underneath the rectangular prism with no issues. And I'm going to use a darker color. It doesn't have to be pure black, but pretty close to it. For my shadow, I know that it gets darker right underneath where it hits on the surface, and then will get lighter as it gets further away. So I need to use my pressure tool there, where that's going to change the opacity depending on the pressure that I put on the pen. So again, I'm starting out much darker underneath the cube, and then I'm going to keep working it and pulling it out with lighter and lighter pressure. If I get too dark, I can always correct it by changing my brush to white and going over where I did the darkness and making it kind of lighter. So it's almost like painting, where you're adding black and white and mixing it together. Now I'm going to start adding some shading to the surfaces and planes of my rectangular prism here, based on my picture where I see it a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. Again, so I won't be putting necessarily straight white to pull out if I've put too much darkness on there, but I'll use the gray. And anytime you open up the color selection box, if you keep that box open and kind of hover your mouse over to the left, you can use an eyedropper tool to select any color you want. So say I wanted the exact same color I used before, I could use the eyedropper tool to pick up that color. Also be mindful of which layer you're working on. You want to stay on the right layer for the correct plane that you are shading. Once you're happy with your rectangular prism, you're going to move on to shading a sphere. So go ahead and sketch it out just like we did before on the background copy. You can use the hard brush that recognizes pressure. It's up to you if you want to use the opacity indicator at the top, but go ahead and sketch out your circle and your shadow based on whatever picture you've Googled. You want to have a reference picture again for this. My screen recording just doesn't pick up the split screen, but I have one as well, that same picture that I was looking at before. Now the shading for a sphere is very different from a cube or rectangular prism because it doesn't have any flat planes on it. It's completely round. So we're going to have a core shadow, a highlight, midtones, a reflected highlight. Sometimes there's light reflected in the shadow. So I'll pull up kind of a diagram here of what that looks like, and that is of course dependent on the material of the sphere. If it were really glossy, of course it would have a harder highlight, or also where the light source is coming from. Continue working at your sphere until you feel like it's just perfect. If you didn't notice earlier, what I did before was I went to that tool, the selection tool, and if you hold it down, you can change it from a rectangular marquee tool to an elliptical marquee tool, and holding shift at the same time as you make your elliptical will select it in a perfect circle. So that's how I made mine a perfect circle. I selected my sphere within that circle, and then I went to at the top of the page, select inverse, and that selects everything except that sphere. So whenever I pressed delete, it got rid of everything that was outside of those lines, which I really needed because I wasn't making a perfect circle. Save both of these files in the designated spot and go ahead and practice with some more forms if you finish early. Good luck!